A Patriot Story, Chapter 3. On the ride home from church, Paul and Carson sat in front, discussing the work that lay ahead for them. Joel McAdams had tried his best to dissuade Carson from giving up his Senate seat. To no avail. Once Carson Lee made up his mind, there was little that could change it. "Have you given Darling's offer any serious consideration?" Paul asked. "A little," Carson said. "Truth be told, I'm not sure if I want to be associated with Big Oil." James Bradford Darling was a classmate of Carson's all the way through school. He was a trust fund kid. His dad was CEO of Trans-Alaska Fuels. When James graduated from college, he went to work for his dad and rapidly rose through the ranks of the company. He currently held the position of vice president in charge of acquisitions. It was widely believed that he would succeed his father as CEO when he retired in a few years. James Darling was always used to getting what he wanted, and he has his sights set on Carson Lee. Carson didn't have a college degree, and in reality, the job that Darling offered him was a pretty sweet gig for anyone, let alone a high school grad. Carson and Darling were never really friends in school. They traveled in completely different circles. Carson was into sports and dated just one girl throughout high school, Angela Carter, the woman who became his wife. They were both fully involved in their youth group at church and devoted to serving God. James Darling, on the other hand, only cared about two things in high school: partying and womanizing, and he pursued both with the highest level of enthusiasm. However, the one thing they both had in common was their love of running. Both men were star cross-country runners in school. Carson just slightly better in his stats than his teammate. It always bothered Darling that no matter how hard he tried, he could not match Carson's talent and ability on the track. Actually, had he applied himself more and partied less, he could have given Carson a real run for his money. But after high school, when Carson joined the Marine Corps, he continued to excel in running. He broke the camp record for speed and endurance during his time at Camp Pendleton in California, a record he still holds today. He even entered several civilian Ironman competitions off base in his various duty assignments, winning first place in two of those as well. All that ended, however, when an enemy sniper blew his kneecap off on a dusty road outside of Afghanistan. Carson and his unit ran over an IED in the roadway, which flipped their truck on its side, killing the driver and top gunner. The rest of the team was pinned behind the wreckage with an enemy sniper taking pot shots at them. Carson sustained wounds to his thigh and his foot in the explosion. Even with those injuries, he managed to get each of his surviving team members to cover behind the overturned truck. As he limped over to pull his last team member off the road to the cover of the truck, he was dragging the unconscious man when the sniper's bullet ripped through his knee. Carson collapsed, and without disregard for his own injury, he dragged his teammate the final 20 yards to safety as bullets flew all around them. Carson was medevaced out to a hospital after an unmanned drone neutralized the enemy sniper that had attacked him. When Carson woke up in that hospital, his right leg had been amputated from just above the knee. With that came his eventual inevitable medical discharge from the Marine Corps. Carson was a staff sergeant and had planned a long career in the Corps. He loved serving his country and wanted nothing else but to spend his whole career doing so. In the year that followed his discharge, he struggled to get proficient at walking with his titanium prosthetic that he had been given in place of the leg he lost. He struggled equally hard to fight back the bitterness he felt toward the doctors for making the decision to take it. That bitterness extended to his government, his beloved Corps, and even to the God he loved and served all his life. He went through some pretty extensive rehab during that first year. It was grueling and slow in its progression. Carson knew that eventually he would get used to getting around on the prosthetic, and he was committed to the rehab and attacked it like he did everything else in his life, with vigor and determination. The harder battle was with the bitterness he felt. He hardly left his property in those days, except to drive down to the VA Medical Center in Anchorage. He has 2 Anatolian shepherds that needed daily exercise, and so that forced him to get out and walk the property as soon as he was able. About half a mile or so up behind the barn, the trail turned a corner and exposed the most breathtaking southern view imaginable. It was a couple months before he was able to make the ascent, but once he could, he did so daily. He would sit on a rock outcropping, overlooking the distant valley below and the endless mountain ranges beyond. This was his refuge, his escape from the world. This would be the place he would reconnect with God and with the faith that he questioned in those early days of his recovery. One particularly beautiful early summer morning, Carson made the trek to his spot, his 2 dogs accompanying him up the mountain trail. As he sat, dogs beside him, watching the sun rise over the mountain to the east, he asked, as he had countless times in the past few months, why? Why did God allow this to happen? As he sat there in the early morning quiet, he felt the tug at his heartstrings. He heard that still small voice speak to him from within himself. Why not? Why not you? It asked. Carson, in that humbling moment of self-awareness, realized, indeed, why not me? Who am I? What was so special about him that he felt he did not deserve this terrible thing to happen? For Carson, that realization, as humbling as it ended up being, hit him like a freight train. He started to really think about it. Who was he indeed? Christ was the Son of God, actually God himself. He suffered a horrible death at the hands of ungodly men. He sacrificed himself for the remission of all mankind's sin. What was it about Carson that made him think he did not deserve to suffer this loss, as terrible as it was personally? He was just a sinner, a mere man. He closed his eyes and prayed to God for understanding and for acceptance. He pulled the Bible he kept with him always from his backpack and started searching the scripture for an answer. He had not looked through it in many months, but the passage came quickly as he flipped through the pages. He came to rest on 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 7, which he read. And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure. Carson paused and looked out over the vast expanse of mountain ranges in front of him. He realized what the Apostle Paul was saying in that scripture text. The Bible doesn't identify what Paul's thorn in the flesh was, but he realized that Satan causes those physical maladies in us to dissuade us from our faith, to cause us to turn from Christ, to turn from service to God. Then he remembered Paul's letter to the Philippians, written when he was held in a Roman prison. Paul was writing to the church at Philippi to encourage them to continue in their work for the Lord. He was writing to thank them for supplying him with his basic needs on his mission journey prior to being taken prisoner. He flipped through the pages of his Bible until he found it. Philippians chapter 4, verse 11. He read it to himself. Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am, therewith to be content. Carson understood now. The tears poured down his cheeks. He looked around at the beauty which surrounded him, the rising sun, the mountains, the mist evaporating from the hillside in the early morning sunlight, and the fog which covered the lowest valley like a thick cotton blanket. He pulled in a deep breath of fresh mountain air and watched his dogs as they chased each other and locked jaws in playful mock combat. He looked up to the heavens, which truly did declare the glory of God. And he thanked God. For the first time since waking up in that field hospital with only one leg, he apologized to God for his bitterness, for his judgment. He thanked God for the measure of health that he did have. He realized at that moment that he was indeed blessed. He was blessed to be here today in this place. So many others he had served with had not returned home. Yes, Carson thought, he truly was blessed. Then he felt the shame and the guilt for feeling bitter. He realized something else as well. Satan, who Scripture tells us walks the earth as a roaring lion, seeking who he might devour, was almost successful in devouring him. He almost defeated Carson and took away his ability to serve God. Satan almost completely destroyed Carson's faith. Carson was sure of his salvation. He knew Satan would never have his soul. And Satan knew it too. But he always knew that if Satan could destroy his faith, then he could live the rest of his life out of fellowship with God, not serving the God that he loved. That would have been a tragedy for Carson and a certain victory for the devil. Right there on that mountain in that moment, Carson promised God that he would never again question his will. That no matter what his thorn in the flesh would manifest itself to be, he would always serve him with everything he had. In that moment, in that place, Carson Lee completely surrendered his life to Christ. Humbled and renewed, he got up and marched back toward his homestead. He had a new sense of purpose, a new sense of direction for his life. When Carson walked up the steps, he heard the phone ringing in his living room through the open window. He went in and picked it up just before the caller hung up. "Hello," he said. The voice on the other end hesitated for a brief moment and said, "I would like to speak with Carson Lee, please." Carson responded, "Speaking." The voice on the other end said, "Please hold for the President of the United States." When the President picked up on the line, he was brief, cordial, and succinct. He told Carson that, on behalf of a grateful nation, he was thanking him for his service to the Marine Corps and for the heroic act that selflessly saved 5 members of his recon team that day his truck hit the IED in Afghanistan. He went on to say that Carson was being awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions that day. The President then excused himself and told Carson to hold for his travel secretary, who would work with him to make arrangements for Carson to fly out to D.C. the following week for the award ceremony. 1 month After that ceremony, 11 years ago now, Carson would officially enter the Senate race as a candidate for his home state of Alaska, which that November he would win by a landslide.